of the recent strike and the killing of Iran's Revolutionary Guard leader Soleimani. There is no question, no doubt that Soleimani was a bad actor, an enemy of the United States with American blood on his hands. The concern I have now is American security, the safety of Americans in the region and around the world, men and women in uniform, our diplomats, and ordinary citizens. And I'm concerned as well about the security of our nation here at home. I want to hear from the administration the strategy for protecting Americans abroad and at home. And equally important, the strategy involved in this assassination of a leader of a country with which we are not at war, in a nation where we are not at war, and what the ramifications are and the path ahead for protecting the United States. I'm deeply concerned about the dangers of a costly, long-term military confrontation with Iran, the dangers of attacks on Americans, organized attacks and terrorist attacks by a potential enemy that uses asymmetric tactics effectively. And Congress has a job to do here. Our job is oversight. We need to effectively demand from the administration all of the facts and the truth, which so far has not been forthcoming, about the rationale and the strategy, if there is one, and what the preparations are for the path ahead, which raises severe dangers. Now, impeachment also is a matter of national security because the president has been impeached for holding hostage taxpayer-funded military assistance to a friend and ally, literally fighting for its life against Russian aggression in return for assistance to him personally, political benefit to him. And the abuse of power involved there raises a direct threat to our national security, as well as the obstruction of Congress. We need the witnesses and documents that we have requested. Some of our colleagues have expressed misgivings about Leader McConnell's strategy of, in effect, a Trump cover-up, blocking documents, gagging witnesses, in effect, hiding the truth. And the American people want a full and fair proceeding. The misgivings expressed by a couple of our colleagues, Senators Murkowski and Collins, show that the McConnell wall is seeming to crack. But whether our colleagues who have expressed those same misgivings privately will put them publicly, and whether any of them will act on them, remains to be seen. If they fail to demand a full, fair proceeding, they will be judged. They'll be judged by history, and there is a court of appeals here, the court of public opinion, which will haunt them just as history will haunt them. And so I am hopeful that we will have a full, fair proceeding, that Senator McConnell, who has responsibility over the witnesses and documents that will be produced, as well as the timing of the impeachment trial, will be reasonable and talk to our leader, Senator Schumer, and that the two of them will engage in productive negotiations. What we want here is the facts and the truth, a full, fair proceeding. But my immediate concern and overriding focus right now is on our national security. At this moment of grave peril, we ought to be focused on American men and women serving abroad or traveling there, not only in the region, but elsewhere, because this action clearly has the effect of further destabilizing an already unstable area of the world. And we need to be deeply concerned about the dangers that have been raised. As much as we may welcome the death of an enemy with blood, American blood, on his hands, we need to be prepared and vigilant and actively engaged in protecting our national security.
Thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal. Thank you all for joining us here today. It is shocking to know that the United States has engaged in the assassination of a high-level foreign official, despite the fact that he unquestionably is responsible for the death of hundreds of Americans. The question we have to be asking ourselves today is whether Qasem Soleimani is more dangerous to the United States alive or dead as a martyr who will now rally the Iranian government and Iranian proxies around the region to do even greater harm to American interests. The stated reason for the assassination of General Soleimani was to prevent attacks against the United States. My guess is that the assassination of Soleimani will lead to greater harm to U.S. personnel, U.S. citizens, and U.S. interests. That is why previous Democratic and Republican administrations chose not to assassinate Soleimani, despite their knowledge of his complicity in harm against United States interests. And the question moving forward is whether the administration has given any thought as to how to manage the fallout that comes from such a drastic action. This is the equivalent of the Iranians assassinating the U.S. Secretary of Defense. If the Iranians were to assassinate the U.S. Secretary of Defense, we would consider that an act of war, and we would respond disproportionately. I think we need to expect that the Iranians will also act disproportionately. I do not believe the administration has gamed out how very badly this could go for the U.S. and our interests. It is incumbent upon the administration to come to Congress and explain why they had to take this specific action in order to prevent harm to Americans abroad. It is also incumbent upon the administration to come to Congress to get authorization for future military action. Now, I think it's debatable whether there was legal justification for this strike. There is no debate that the War Powers Act requires the administration to now come before Congress and ask for authorization for any future military activity against Iran. In fact, the War Powers Act was put into place specifically to guard against a series of escalatory military actions that accidentally lead to war. And so the War Powers Act was passed for this kind of crisis. And every member of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, should now be requiring, demanding that the administration come to Congress with a full explanation of the justification for this strike and a request for authorization if they intend to take out any future military activity. Secretary Pompeo said today that Americans in the region are safer than ever before. That's not true. At the very time he was making that statement, he was ordering the evacuation of all Americans from Iraq, a country we are not at war with today, a country that is vital to our national security interests. Americans in the Middle East are at much greater harm today than they were yesterday. And at the very least, the administration deserves to tell us the truth about what happened and about the consequences for American security interests moving forward. They're not off to a good start today. They are not telling Americans the truth about the consequences of what they did. Senator Blumenthal is right. Impeachment is about a national security crisis as well. Part of the reason we have gotten ourselves into this mess in the Middle East is because no one trusts the United States any longer. They watched what we did to Ukraine, pulling a friend into a domestic political crisis. And countries now want to stay as far away from the United States as they can. The reason we needed to move forward with impeachment is because the president was trying to steal the 2020 election. We had to set in motion a series of consequences for his effort to try to rig the upcoming election. But the president was also jeopardizing, and is jeopardizing, American security, because he has telegraphed to allies and would-be allies that if you do business with the United States, you will become subject to the president's personal political priorities. In order to protect the United States, we had to move forward with this set of consequences. I agree with Senator Blumenthal. I don't see how we have a fair trial without an attempt to discover the truth. I've been fairly open about my belief as to the necessary consequences for the president's actions. I do believe that the evidence I've seen thus far merits removal from office, but I remain open to changing my mind if the president presents exculpatory evidence. Part of the reason why I want to see people like Mike Pompeo and Mick Mulvaney testify is because it might present me with evidence that would change my mind. I don't know why Republicans don't have the same interest. They may today not believe that the president's actions warrant removal, but why wouldn't they want to get additional evidence and information before they make up their mind? This is not a criminal trial. We shouldn't hold it to the exact same standard. But it is a fact-finding endeavor, and we should make at least a minimal attempt to try to discover facts that the House could not. These are both matters of grave national security. Finally, I will offer one more point of agreement with Senator Blumenthal. Over the course of the next 24 hours, I think we'll have conversations with our leadership and perhaps with Republicans as well about the timing of our deliberations, both on impeachment and with respect to the path forward on Iran. Next week will be a very important and a very busy week, and I think we're both looking forward to having conversations with our colleagues throughout the rest of the day. Be happy to answer questions.
Senator Blumenthal, Keith McGilvery, we're live on Fox 61 this morning. Iran is vowing revenge at this point. You have tweeted that this could bring the most consequential military confrontation in decades, and an analyst told us this morning this is tantamount to declaring war against Iran. What do you say to Americans who are concerned that that is in fact the case?
Americans should be demanding the truth of this administration about whether there is a strategy and what the facts are to protect Americans abroad and at home, because we are under severe threat. And the administration should be coming to Congress. It needs authorization if we are going to have a prolonged, costly military confrontation amounting to war. That is a matter of law. And to Americans who are fearful, I would say we should come together as never before in recent history on a bipartisan basis, put aside our differences, demand the truth from this administration, ask what the strategy is, and how we can protect America at home and abroad. The threat to the homeland, as well as to Americans abroad, is the result of further destabilizing this region and, in effect, provoking a confrontation. Was it necessary? What is the strategy? What is the end game?
So both of you, there seems to be no question that this action will prompt some sort of retaliation, be it against one of our embassies, or Saudi Arabia, or Israel, or all three. Given that that likelihood is so strong today, isn't moving forward with impeachment even more difficult than it was yesterday, because you have a commander-in-chief at war?
I think we are going to talk with our colleagues over the course of the day and the weekend as to the proper course of action moving forward. What is critical is that the administration come before Congress right now and explain their rationale for the actions that they've taken and the steps necessary to prevent this from escalating into war. That has to happen immediately. We will go back to Washington this afternoon if the administration is prepared to brief us. And it is also important to remember that the Constitution vests the authority to declare war in only one branch of government, and that is the legislature. Now, people are going to wake up today very fearful of what is to come next for Americans abroad, troops in harm's way, but they need to know that they will have a role to play in the decisions moving forward. If the president observes the law, if the president observes the Constitution, he will come to Congress, he will come to the American people to ask for the permission that is required in order to take further military steps.
Let me just add, Mark, in response to that question. Congress has two jobs to do here, and both are unavoidable. One is the impeachment trial, which is imposed on us by the Constitution, and the other is to protect our national security and to declare war if that is going to happen. All of us hope there will be no broader, longer, more costly military confrontation in lives or in treasure. But Congress has a responsibility. I have been in touch with colleagues. I'm going to be calling for an immediate hearing by the Armed Services Committee. We need to hear from the Secretary of Defense, since he appears to be the prime decision maker here. And Congress as a whole should be briefed. We have not been consulted. We learned about these events literally by watching the news last night. Whether they contacted any leaders remains to be seen. And so we're very much in the same position as the American people, apprehensive about the path ahead, uncertain about what this destabilization of the region means to America, to Americans and Americans' interests.
Maybe I didn't make myself clear. Don't you think that Senator McConnell will say that moving forward with an impeachment trial in this time of crisis would be not a good idea?
Well, that is a really very pertinent question, because the decision really is Senator McConnell's. He will need to talk to his Republican colleagues. They're in the majority. And Speaker Pelosi will need to decide when she's going to send the articles of impeachment. So the ball is in Senator McConnell's court, as I indicated at the very start, both as to the timing and the calling of witnesses and documents, because a full, fair proceeding is the objective, and both are possible. Congress can do both.
And let me just say this. We have a constitutional obligation to hold a trial on the articles of impeachment sent to us by the House of Representatives. There is no choice involved as to whether or not we hold a trial and come to a conclusion on the articles of impeachment. So I just want to make that clear. So I don't know what Senator McConnell is going to say today, but there is no option to indefinitely postpone action on articles of impeachment. If Senator McConnell commits to a process to bring a handful of witnesses before the Senate, we could be done with a trial in a matter of weeks, not months. But there is no question we have an obligation to move forward with this trial. And we have the ability to dispense our constitutional obligation to proceed with this trial and hear from the administration and have a debate moving forward about this crisis in the Middle East. In fact, we have a responsibility to do both of those things.
Senator Murphy, just a couple of days ago, you said the attack on our embassy in Baghdad is horrifying and predictable, Trump rendering America impotent in the Middle East. Do you still think America is impotent in the Middle East, given what we've just seen?
Ultimately, my worry is that this is going to prove feckless. there may be chest beating happening this morning about the elimination of a very bad man in the Middle East, but if it ends up in more Americans being killed, more American interests being harmed, then it will in fact make us even weaker in the long run. So I remain deeply concerned about the position that the administration has put us in the region. We are weaker than ever before. It may be that the president is trying to make up for mistakes in the region by taking this escalatory action. But if this action, after the headlines fade, ultimately make us more vulnerable to attack, ultimately push our allies away from us, then it doesn't serve U.S. interests. Already this morning, the Iraqi prime minister has sent out an unequivocal message that this action was taken in contravention of our military arrangement in Iraq. One of the real risks here is that the United States gets ejected from Iraq, and thus we are unable to carry out our mission against ISIS. That would be very bad for the United States and very bad for our interests in the region.
And I just want to emphasize a point here, because Senator Murphy just used a word that we haven't used so far this morning, allies. Where are our allies as we move forward? Britain, France, Germany remain in the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. We withdrew unilaterally. We have been involved in this strike essentially unilaterally. And that is a break from the past, where our allies have been at our side, they've been at our back as well, and part of the strategy question is, where are our allies?
Given the timing of the strikes on the eve of an impeachment trial, do either of you suspect that that played a role into the military decision? And two, does that play into your call for why the administration needs to publicly make the case for why these strikes were necessary and legally justified?
For the time being, I'm going to choose to take the administration at its word that they believed there were imminent attacks against the United States. Obviously, with this president, you have to worry about ulterior motives. He has made it clear that he is willing to use the national security tools at his disposal in order to advance his personal political priorities. That is, in fact, the subject of the impeachment trial. I refuse to come to any judgment about this particular action until I have heard from the administration. The reality is that Iran is constantly considering and planning attacks against U.S. interests in the region. The question is whether or not it was necessary to assassinate the second most powerful person in the country to stop those attacks. Remember, Soleimani was replaced within a matter of hours. The Quds Force still exists as a lethal instrument of Iranian power in the region. So part of why we need to get a briefing is that it doesn't stand to reason that this action actually prevents attacks against American interests in the region. To me, it looks as if it will, in fact, encourage attacks against American interests in the region. So the bottom line is, yes, of course we are always worried about the president's clear willingness to use his official powers in order to advance his political interests. I have no knowledge that that is the case in this instance.
And let me, I agree with Senator Murphy, and it's an important question. Let me put my answer a little bit differently. I can't know the motivations, but I can see the ramifications, the very dangerous potential ramifications in war and attacks on Americans, terrorist activities that directly imperil the United States. And all of those concerns would be as grave and urgent even without an impeachment trial pending. And I would demand a public explanation to Congress and the American people, regardless of the impeachment trial, because the apparent lack of long-term strategy and preparation would be as deeply a concern.
Senators, can you share some insight on maybe what you're trying to do to facilitate those cracks in the Republican wall on impeachment, if they exist?
Well, I've been talking to colleagues. That's really what I've been doing. As recently as yesterday, I talked to one of my colleagues about the documents that have just been revealed. If it weren't for what happened last night, we would be talking right now about the documents that have come from the Center for Public Integrity and separately from an organization known as Just Security, which show the Pentagon actively criticizing and resisting the president's decision to withhold this $400 million at a time when Ukraine desperately needed it, and the possibility of it actually being expended was in grave doubt. The comptroller of the Pentagon, Elaine McCusker, was raising the question about whether this $400 million could actually be expended before the end of the fiscal year, so that Ukraine might be deprived of large parts of it if the president continued his hold. And this correspondence, which you can now read about, is another dramatic revelation about the need for documents and witnesses. So I have talked to my colleagues, one of them last night, yesterday, about this issue. And I'm hoping that more of them will share the misgivings of senators who have expressed them so far. I hope their courage will be contagious. I hope their courage will be demonstrated in action, not just in words.
I would just add to that. Listen, I don't think we can rely on Republicans to take the initiative. We are going to ultimately have to put motions before the Senate in the coming weeks to require the production of documents and the testimony of witnesses. There are a lot of Republicans who know their constituents support a fair trial, and I think we are going to have to put those senators on record. It would be better for us to be able to get an agreement between Republicans and Democrats, but if we cannot, then my belief is that we are ultimately going to have to force votes on the floor of the Senate. And let me just make one last comment about the documents. I want documents and I want witnesses, but I also want to make clear we have a pretty full picture already of the crimes and abuses that the president committed. I want to see the full record because I want to double check that the conclusion that I've come to is the right one, as I would expect Republicans would as well. But it's not as if we are missing evidence to suggest a level of abuse that would merit removal from office. What we're potentially missing, to give the president all the credit I can muster for him, is potentially exculpatory evidence. And so, I would think it's in his interest to present these witnesses if indeed he thinks that he is innocent.
If I were the prosecutor here, and I did that for a while, I could rest my case. The president has the opportunity, and some would say the burden, of coming forward with evidence that shows his innocence. But I think there is overwhelming evidence in favor of removal and conviction. And I think that our colleagues on both sides of the aisle have heard over the last 2 weeks from overwhelming numbers of the American people who want documents and witnesses. 70% of the American people, more than 60% of Republicans, feel that the Senate should hear from those witnesses and should see those documents, and the American people deserve to see and hear them as well. I think that's far more effective in persuading our colleagues, and they are going to have to go on record. There's no question, if Senator McConnell refuses to be reasonable, if he continues to enable the president to run his own trial, that's what he is doing. He's putting the defendant in charge of the trial. They're going to have to vote. And they will have to vote on specific witnesses, and on documents, and they'll have to go on record.
Yeah, you know, President Trump obviously evinces strong sentiments in this state. I wanted to get back to sort of an earlier question about, you know, conducting an impeachment under these circumstances. Do you know, what are your thoughts on, you know, how this could even further polarize, you know, the electorate here and you know, energize, you know, partisans on both sides of this question? I mean, it already was going to, and now you add, you know, we could be in a, as you pointed out, in a military conflict as this goes on.
Well, I don't think that we're allowed to look at the political considerations of war. I don't think that we're allowed to think about the political consequences of removing a president. You know, we have to make decisions based upon what we think is right and wrong. Of course, you have to be listening to your constituents on every decision you make in Washington, but I think we have to be making evaluations on both impeachment and the future course of policy in the Middle East without viewing any of this through a political lens. Now, I do think that one of the most important reasons for the president to seek authorization from Congress before going to war is to make sure that he has made an attempt to get as broad a cross-section of the American public behind him as possible. Yes, sometimes congressional debates on war can be disunifying, but often they can be a mechanism to get the country behind military action. So my worry is that if the president blindly falls into war with Iran without coming to Congress, then he misses an opportunity to have a public debate that could potentially be unifying. If the president indeed believes that there's such serious threats to American interests that the only cause of action is war, then he should be willing to make that case rather than proceed with a series of escalations that accidentally end us up in a large-scale military conflict.
You know, history shows that there is no war that America can't win when we are united. It also shows that war is very, very difficult when the nation is divided. So that's why one of the first points I made was that I hope we can come together on this issue, because we are at a moment of peril, potential war, costly in lives as well as money, and we need to do it in a way that brings us together. But I also want to highlight that there are no more important decisions that we will make in the United States Senate than war and peace or impeachment.
Senator,
And so to try to foresee or predict what the politics are going to be, number one, is almost impossible to do. But more important, we have a really deep constitutional responsibility here to do the right thing.
Senator, I'm following along on our Facebook feed, and I posed this question to your counterpart earlier, but just to go back to what the Secretary of State was saying this morning as to whether Americans are safer or not, a lot of folks commenting this morning, he was a terrorist, it's good that he's gone, supporting the president. You know, are we safer this morning than we were yesterday?
We need to make ourselves safer. There are severe dangers raised by this action. The ramifications are potentially perilous. We need to take immediate action to protect Americans abroad and the security of our homeland. But let me just emphasize that General Soleimani was an enemy with American blood on his hands, a terrorist leader. The question is, what is our strategy? And so far, the administration has failed to be forthcoming with facts or strategy and rationale.
If we could just go back to that new document for a minute. Obviously, that's not part of the report from the House because it wasn't available to them. Is isn't this technically new evidence? Was that what you were saying earlier, Senator Murphy, that you would file a motion to admit this new document?
Well, listen, this is clearly new evidence, but it is heavily redacted evidence. So the documents that were disclosed are heavily redacted, and so there is clearly very important information inside these documents that we have not seen. So this is why Congress needs to request all communications in the White House pertinent to the suspension of aid to Ukraine. Because even in the unredacted sections of these documents, what has been disclosed is damning. What Senator Blumenthal didn't mention is that inside those documents is one clear line in which the individual at OPM, at OMB, who was dealing with this hold, makes clear that the decision came directly from the president. Right. So it's important for us to get not just the documents that were disclosed to the public, to get the entirety of the documents without their redactions. Congress should be able to see all of those communications.
And by the way, Just Security has the unredacted documents, but it's not permitted to reveal them as part of its agreement with the source. And I would just semantically differ somewhat with Senator Murphy. None of these documents is new evidence. Let's be very clear. None of these documents are newly discovered evidence. They are evidence that was hidden and concealed. The president blocked this evidence. He gagged the witnesses. Every one of these documents was sought by the House. It's not new evidence. It's newly revealed evidence that we knew was there. And that is the heart of the matter. The president has blocked every single request for documents, every single one of them, from the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, OMB, the White House, every single one of them blocked, and up to 12 witnesses gagged. They're not newly discovered. Mick Mulvaney, Robert Blair, Michael Duffy, and others that we are seeking, they're not new. We knew they were there. They were blocked.
Senator Murphy, I assume you agree with the disagreement of the former president.
It's not a disagreement. Semantic difference.
Now, listen, I mean, one of the articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton was obstruction of justice. And Bill Clinton gave his blood to the investigators, right? I mean, the hypocrisy from Republicans is pretty stunning, given the fact that that they brought an obstruction of justice charge against President Clinton, and he produced documents, he produced witnesses, and he in fact allowed for the special counsel to take a blood sample from his body. President Trump has done everything possible to block everyone from testifying. And remember, the only people that have testified did so against the wishes, against the demands from the administration. Gordon Sondland, who is the most damning witness, testified even after being told not to by this administration. So, of course, this is the exact reason that we want these emails, is because we know that there's a reason that the administration is hiding them. I think it's logical to believe that the administration doesn't want people like Mick Mulvaney to testify, doesn't want people to see these emails, because they know that it will be lock-tight, airtight evidence that the president committed impeachable offenses.
Based on precedent, when you call for the administration to brief Congress, and you also are calling for the administration to essentially brief the U.S. public, I get that. But based on precedent, what would a briefing to Congress, what should a briefing to Congress entail, as far as who would get that briefing and what would the extent of it be?
I think the administration will brief Congress. I think that we will have a briefing. I would prefer for that to happen today. I would guess it will happen at the beginning of next week. That briefing should be from the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. It should be from the highest level U.S. officials. There should also be intelligence. Gina Haspel should be there as well to present to Congress the underlying intelligence that led to this strike. It should be to the entire Senate and to the entire Congress. I sit on the Foreign Relations Committee. That's the committee that has the authority and the responsibility for declarations of war. But that disclosure from the administration should come to all senators and all members of Congress, and it should happen immediately. I think both of us stand ready to return to Washington the minute that briefing is noticed. And I think we will both be on the phone today trying to discover as much of this information by phone as we can.
Based on precedent, these briefings occur frequently. Often they are classified. They occur in what's known as the SCIF, which is the classified area, and they are to the whole Senate. The same is done with the House in their similar facility. My point earlier was we should have public briefings. We should have public hearings with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State under oath in public, which does not happen in these so-called briefings. And I have complained often about these classified briefings that more of them should be made public, because they often involve information that is well known to our adversaries and enemies. We know the facts. They know the facts. The only people who don't know the facts are the American people.
When President Obama requested congressional authorization for strikes against Syria, Secretary Kerry and the Secretary of Defense came before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and I believe the Armed Services Committee in public testimony.
So does Congress need to consider a new authorization for use of military force, or is that a decision that?
In a word, yes.
It does.
Yeah,
It does.
Both of us have advocated that the present authorization for the use of military force, and I said this last night, in no way covers the possibility of a new war with Iran.
We needed to debate a new authorization of military force before this
Long
crisis. So.
Didn't President Clinton do the same thing without authorization when he launched the attack against the drug factory in Africa trying to get Osama bin Laden?
I mean, didn't he do it without congressional authorization? Well, again, the president has the ability to act without congressional authorization if he's trying to stop an imminent attack against the United States. But he has a burden to prove that the action he took was necessary to stop that attack. I think our worry is that in this case, the action he took is actually going to precipitate attacks against American personnel. But yes, there has long been an exception to the Article 1 reservation of power on war declaration in order to prevent imminent attacks against the United States. And, for people, crowing that President Obama went after Osama bin Laden without a congressional authorization, well, that was clearly authorized by the 2001 AUMF. The president had an existing authority to target militarily anyone who was responsible for the September 11th attacks against the United States. There is no war authorization against the state of Iran. And so, well, the president is welcome to make the case that he needed to take this action in order to prevent an imminent attack. My guess is that the evidence in the end will suggest that this action likely will create and end up creating more threats to American interests abroad, not less.
The strike was long before 9/11.
Yeah, I don't know the
Mark, I think Chris put it very well at the beginning. The question of this strike, debatable. The question of war with Iran, not debatable. He needs approval from Congress. And we're saying he needs to come to Congress now to provide a strategy and rationale, and to the American people with all of the facts.
Take one more.
The both of you have called for strategy from the White House moving forward. To Americans at home who have questions, what should that strategy look like? What should we do next?
Well, I mean, that's hard for us to sit here and say without the evidence that underlied the justification for the strike. So the burden is on the president who ordered this strike to explain to the American public what the strategy is. Neither Senator Blumenthal nor I ordered the assassination of the second leading political figure in Iran. So the administration needs to present to us how this action sits inside a broader strategy. Let me give you a preview. It doesn't. The president's strategy on Iran has been all tactical, devoid of strategy. They have largely made this up from day to day. And so I do not think you are going to get an explanation for these actions that sits inside a broader strategy that protects American interests. But that's the burden of the president today and through the weekend to present that to Congress.
How do you not see this targeted killing then as a cynical attempt by a president under pressure for his job to distract the entire issue from the American public?
Well, I think that's, Ken, I think, that's the same question that Mark asked in a slightly more pointed way. And all I would say is we can't know the motivation. We know what the dangerous ramifications are, and I'm looking at what those dangers are. That's our job, try to protect the nation. And that's why we want to hear from the president, because only he can justify this attack on the leader of a sovereign nation, not an attack on a terrorist figure, and whether there was sufficient rationale for it. I mean, the contention is that he was planning, that General Soleimani was planning an attack on Americans. Well, we need to know what it was. We need to know what the rationale.
I'm generally not in the business of defending the president's motivations, but I mean, it is important to look at the context here. We have been in a months-long series of escalatory actions with the Iranians. Many of us have raised objections to that escalatory behavior for the entirety of that period. And so I do think that you have to place last night's action in the context of a long run-up. In some ways, what happened last night was predictable, given the fact that neither side seemed to be open to negotiation or dialogue, and neither side seemed to present any real off-ramps. So we don't know the motivation, but I do think it's important to look at what happened last night in a context that has existed in many ways separate and aside from the drama over impeachment.
And again, just to give the president his due, this man was an enemy of the United States. He's been responsible for killing many Americans. Americans in uniform and American civilians, innocent Americans whose blood is on his hands. Let nobody doubt that he was an enemy of this nation and very dangerous to the nation. And so I think on that point, we are in agreement.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, guys.
There are a lot of parallels between the Clinton attack on Osama bin Laden in Khartoum in 1998 during an impeachment. A terrorist leader, he is. But Quds has been identified for a long time as a terrorist organization.
One is a leader of a sovereign state. The other is a leader of a non-state terrorist organization. That is a fairly important difference. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.